In the summer of 1876, a health inspector touring a mining camp in Nevada Territory documented what he found in a row of structures behind the main street. Each one was approximately 6 feet wide and 6 feet deep. A single bed, a small shelf, no window, no ventilation beyond the gap under the door. He counted 31 of them in a single row, pressed together like stalls, each with a woman inside. He wrote in his report that the conditions were unfit for habitation. The report went into a drawer somewhere. The row remained for another 12 years. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know, if this is the kind of history that tells the truth instead of the comfortable story. Subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Here is a question that deserves a real answer. Have you ever seen a Western film where a saloon girl walked across a crowded room in a silk dress, smiled at the right man, and the scene moved on? Did you ever wonder what happened when the camera wasn't there? Because the story that got told about women in that position in the frontier West was designed to be palatable. The reality behind it was designed by no one. It just existed in the dark, in those 6x6 wooden boxes, and it is almost nothing like what appeared on screen. The mythology of the frontier saloon girl has a specific look, a dress with color, a room with light and music, men who were rough but charming, and women who navigated them with a kind of knowing grace. It is a story built from the top of a very specific hierarchy, and it represents a fraction of the women who worked in that economy. The vast majority were never in the saloon at all. They were in the cribs. A crib was not a room in any meaningful sense. It was a wooden box, 6 feet wide, sometimes less. A single bed took up most of the space. There might be a small shelf holding a basin, a bottle, a candle. There was usually no window. The door, when closed, made the interior nearly dark. The walls were thin enough that sound moved through them without resistance. The sounds of the adjacent cribs, the sounds of the alley outside, the sounds of a mining camp that ran without stopping because the mines ran without stopping. The women who occupied these structures did not choose them in any meaningful sense of that word. They arrived in a territory where their options had already been narrowed by forces that had nothing to do with individual decision-making. Some had traveled west expecting domestic work or factory work that didn't materialize. Some had been brought by men who made promises that turned out to mean something different. Some had exhausted every other alternative and arrived at this one because it was the one remaining. A woman who entered the crib economy in a mining camp in 1872 was entering a system that had very little room in it for her to accumulate any advantage. The operators who rented the cribs charged for the space. The fee was deducted from what the woman earned, laudanum, which most women in this situation used in significant quantities, cost money. Medicine when illness came, and illness came constantly, cost money. Food cost money. Every expense in the ledger reduced what remained, and what remained was usually very little. And this is where things change, because the volume was the mechanism of control. In a mining camp at the height of a boom, the number of men passing through a crib row on a given night was not the number suggested by any romantic account. Contemporary observers and health inspectors who documented conditions in these areas described numbers that bear no resemblance to the saloon mythology. Dozens per night was documented. In a camp of several thousand men with limited competing options, the arithmetic was merciless. A woman in a crib in the Comstock Lode region in the early 1870s was not having conversations. She was not exercising charm or wit or any of the things the mythology assigned to women in her position. She was performing repetitive labor in a 6-foot box, in conditions of limited light and no ventilation, at a pace determined entirely by the demand outside the door. A miner stepped in from the alley. He had been underground for 12 hours. He was dirty in the specific way that mining made men dirty, not surface dirt, but the ground-in kind, the kind that didn't fully come out with a quick wash, if a wash had happened at all. The transaction was brief. The miner stepped back into the alley. Another stepped in. The door didn't close fully between them in the busiest hours. That was the nature of the system. The laudanum was not a choice that came from leisure or pleasure. It was a functional response to conditions that the human mind, without modification, couldn't endure at the required pace. Laudanum, an opium tincture available over the counter in every general store and pharmacy in the country, sold as a general remedy for pain, anxiety, and sleeplessness, was exactly what its name implied. It made things bearable that were otherwise not bearable. A woman who had been in the cribs for 6 months had already developed a tolerance. A year in, the dose required to produce the same numbing effect was larger than what she had started with. The body adapted to the substance and demanded more of it to achieve the same result. More laudanum meant more money going out. More money going out meant more work required to cover the expense. More work, at the pace the system demanded, meant more need for the laudanum. That loop did not have an exit in it. The physical consequences accumulated separately from the psychological ones. In conditions without running water, without any form of the medical hygiene that might have made a difference, infection was endemic. The diseases that pass through these environments pass through them rapidly and thoroughly. A woman who contracted something had limited access to medical care, and the medical care available had limited tools for what it was being asked to address. Some women managed illness and continued working because stopping meant not paying the rent on the crib, which meant losing it, which meant a different and worse situation. The rent on the crib was paid regardless of whether the woman was healthy enough to work. That was the arrangement. The operator collected regardless. The woman worked regardless of her condition, or she found herself without even the 6-foot box to return to. But here's the problem. The women visible in historical records are the ones whose situations generated paperwork, the ones whose deaths required a coroner's note, the ones whose presence in a town showed up in a census before the census taker moved on, the ones who occasionally spoke to a reporter, a missionary, or a reformer passing through. Below that visible layer, there were women whose entire time in this economy left almost no trace. They arrived, they worked, they died, or they left. No record caught them coming in, and no record noted them going. The historical estimate that roughly 80% of women in frontier prostitution worked in cribs rather than saloon establishments is itself probably an undercount, because the women most thoroughly erased by the system were the ones least likely to have generated any documentation of their existence. A census taker in a Nevada mining town in 1870 walked down the main street and recorded names and ages. He noted occupation as seamstress for many women whose actual occupation was different, because that was the agreed-upon fiction that let the documentation proceed. The women he listed as seamstresses were not seamstresses. But seamstress went into the column, and the actual situation went unrecorded. That fiction protected nobody. It just made the official record tidy. The age of women in these situations was another thing the mythology consistently misrepresented. The romantic version featured grown women making knowing choices. The documented reality from the period shows a significant number of women in their teens, some barely into their teens, in conditions that no mechanism existed to prevent. The legal frameworks of the era were not designed to address this. Age of consent laws, where they existed at all in the Western territories, set the threshold at ages that would be unrecognizable today. The system that operated around the cribs was not illegal by the standards of its time in most jurisdictions. It was simply what existed, and it operated in the open, and the men who ran it paid whatever local fees applied and continued operating. A woman at 17 in a crib row in a Colorado mining camp in 1873 had arrived through some path that the documentation rarely captured fully. Orphaned, perhaps. Brought west by someone who had disappeared or abandoned her. Placed there by someone who made the arrangement and took a portion of what she earned. The specific mechanism of arrival varied. The situation at the end of the path did not vary much. Now think about what the lifespan looked like. Contemporary observers who spent time in these environments and left accounts were consistent on one point. The women they encountered aged at a rate that had no equivalent elsewhere. Not in the way the frontier aged everyone, which was significant. In a more compressed and specific way. Women who had been in the cribs for 3 or 4 years showed physical changes that would ordinarily take decades. The combination of the laudanum addiction, the chronic infections, the malnutrition, because the economics of the crib rarely left enough for adequate food, the lack of sleep, the physical conditions, the psychological weight of the work, all of these operated simultaneously on a body that had no recovery time built into its schedule. The damage compounded. The average active working period before health failed was documented by some observers at between 3 and 5 years. After that, the woman's condition made her unable to maintain the pace the system required. What happened then varied. Some found other work in the same environment in a different capacity. Some left the territory entirely if they had the means and the health. Some died in the crib or near it from causes that the death record might list as fever or exhaustion or, with increasing frequency as the laudanum dependence progressed, overdose. Overdose was documented often enough that it should not be categorized as accidental in any meaningful proportion of cases. The line between taking enough laudanum to make the night endurable and taking enough to end the night permanently was a line that the women in these circumstances understood. Some crossed it deliberately. Some crossed it because the tolerance they had built required quantities that the body could not process. Which, in any given case, was often impossible to determine after the fact. The coroner's notes that survive from mining camp jurisdictions use brief language. Found in crib. Cause unknown. Found in crib. Overdose suspected. The brevity is its own kind of documentation. Here's a question that sits at the center of this. The mining camps that ran these crib rows were making fortunes. The silver and gold coming out of the ground in Nevada and Colorado and Arizona in the 1870s was producing wealth at a scale that was transforming the country. The men who owned the mines, the men who ran the supply operations, the men who owned the land the camps sat on, these men were becoming very rich. The women in the cribs behind the main street were generating revenue for the operators who rented them the boxes. Nobody in that system was poor except the women inside it. How did that arrangement persist as long as it did and as openly as it did? Because the system worked for the people with the power to change it, and changing it was not in their interest. The missionary women who occasionally came through mining camps with the intention of offering alternatives faced a specific problem. The alternative they could offer, domestic work, church shelter, passage somewhere else, competed against an addiction that required a daily chemical input, a debt to the crib operator that had to be settled before leaving was possible, and in some cases, physical circumstances that made the alternative inaccessible, regardless of how much the woman might have wanted it. A woman with a significant laudanum dependence who tried to stop working and leave couldn't simply decide to stop. The physical withdrawal from opium dependence is severe. It was not understood as such at the time, but it was experienced by the women going through it. The symptoms of withdrawal, the physical agony of it, the inability to function, made stopping extremely difficult without medical support that wasn't available in conditions where stopping meant losing the income that paid for the substance that stopping required. The trap was total. It was not designed to be total. Nobody drew up a plan. It just operated through the logic of its own components, each one reinforcing the others, until the system was self-sustaining in a way that captured nearly everyone inside it. And this is where things change in a way that connects to something broader about the frontier myth. The West was sold as a place of freedom. The open land, the clean break, the chance to become something different from whatever you had been before. That promise was real for certain people, in certain circumstances. For the women in the cribs, the frontier was the opposite of freedom. It was the most constrained existence available in a country that offered constrained existences in many forms. They had traveled west, too. They had arrived in a new place, but the new place had the same power arrangements as everywhere else, operating without even the thin social constraints that eastern cities imposed. There was nobody watching. There was nobody whose opinion about what happened in the crib row shaped the behavior of the men who ran it. The freedom of the frontier, for them, was the freedom of the powerful from accountability. Not their freedom, never their freedom. The women who survived and left, who accumulated enough, or got well enough, or found someone who helped them out, rarely talked about what they were leaving. The social cost of having been in that situation followed them wherever they went. The fiction of the seamstress occupation that appeared in census records also appeared in the stories women told about their own pasts when they moved on. It had to, because the alternative was a permanent mark that closed doors that were only slightly open to begin with. A woman who had spent 3 years in a crib in a Nevada mining camp and had somehow found her way to a small town in Oregon in 1879, working as a laundress, had not left the past behind. She had covered it. She carried the laudanum dependence, if she had managed to reduce it at all, quietly. She carried the physical effects of what those years had done to her body. She carried the specific knowledge of what she had been through and the specific necessity of never saying so. She also carried something else, a capability for endurance that was, in its way, extraordinary. Not because the endurance was chosen or noble, because it was what the conditions required, and she had met the requirement and kept existing when a significant number of the women around her had not. That survival was not celebrated, it was hidden, because the only way to go forward was to hide it. Here is the last question. The frontier mythology needed certain kinds of stories and certain kinds of people to put in those stories. It needed pioneers and gunfighters and lawmen and outlaws and the occasional plucky saloon girl who was charming and capable and never quite as trapped as she was. That mythology was constructed over decades by dime novelists and newspaper editors, and later by filmmakers who understood what audiences wanted to believe about the past. What they didn't want to believe, and what therefore got left out, was the crib row, the 31 boxes in a Nevada alley, the health inspector's report in the drawer, The women in those boxes, in the dark, in conditions that the century that built the frontier was content to allow as long as it didn't have to look directly at them. The myth looked elsewhere. It found the saloon girl in the silk dress and put her in the foreground and called that the story. The real story was behind the main street, in the alley, in a box that was 6 feet wide and full of dark. That's what the frontier actually contained, and that's what the mythology worked hardest to erase. The towns themselves had a specific relationship with the crib rows that the mythology never addressed honestly. Municipal governments in mining towns and cattle towns of the 1870s and 1880s were not unaware of what was operating behind their main streets. They were fully aware. The relationship between local government and the crib economy was one of managed tolerance that generated revenue and maintained a certain social order, in the sense that the order preferred by the men who ran these towns was maintained. In some jurisdictions, the operators of crib rows paid a periodic fine, not because their operation was illegal, but because the fine was the mechanism by which the local government collected from them. It was a tax called something else. The women inside the cribs paid it indirectly because the operator passed the cost along the same way he passed every cost along. The fine that officially represented law enforcement was in practice a business license with a different name. A city marshal in a Kansas cattle town in 1874 walked the length of the district on his evening rounds. He knew every operator, every crib, and roughly how many women were working each one. He noted disturbances. He sometimes removed men who had become violent. He did not close any of the cribs. Closing them was not his job and was not what he had been hired to do. His job was to make sure the district ran without producing the kind of trouble that spilled onto the main street and became a problem for the businesses there. As long as the trouble stayed in the alley, it wasn't his trouble. That division, what happened in the alley, staying in the alley, was the operative social contract. The respectable businesses on the main street benefited from the traffic that the district brought to town. The saloons, the general stores, the hotels, the barbers, all of them saw more business when the mining camp or cattle drive brought men with money. The district was part of the ecosystem that produced that traffic. The respectability of the main street was maintained partly by the existence of the alley that absorbed what the main street preferred not to acknowledge. The women in the cribs were not part of the community. They were adjacent to it, necessary to its function, in ways that nobody stated directly and excluded from its protections entirely. When a woman in the crib district died, from overdose, from illness, from violence, from whatever the specific cause turned out to be, the response from the surrounding community was minimal. She was buried in whatever section of the local cemetery accepted her. Some towns had separate sections for this purpose, which enforced in death the separation that had existed in life. The grave might or might not have a marker. It depended on whether anyone arranged one and whether anyone paid for it. A cemetery in a Nevada mining town from this period has a documented section in which a significant number of burials have no names attached. Not because the names weren't known, but because no one thought to record them or no one had been asked to. The women buried there had names. They had histories before they arrived in the camp. Those histories had simply not been followed into the town records in any form that survived. The violence that occurred in the crib districts was also part of the documented record, though imperfectly. A woman who was harmed by a man inside the crib had limited recourse. Reporting to the marshal meant acknowledging the circumstances, which was itself a cost. The marshal might respond or might determine that what happened in the alley was not his concern. The operator might intervene if a woman was being damaged in a way that reduced her ability to work because that affected his revenue. The protection available was the protection of a commodity, not of a person. Some men who worked these districts were violent in specific ways. The records that survive, the coroner's notes, the occasional newspaper account that deemed the incident significant enough to print, describe a range of harm done to women in cribs that includes the non-graphic and the catastrophic. The language of the era is sometimes indirect, but the documented cases are enough to understand that the combination of women in isolated spaces with no legal protection and men whose behavior faced no consequence was producing predictable outcomes. That's not a complicated equation. It's a simple one that nobody in a position to change it had the motivation to change. The reformers who eventually addressed this situation did so slowly, unevenly, and with motives that were not always straightforward. The late 19th century produced a significant reform movement focused on what it called vice, a category that included the crib economy, but also included alcohol, gambling, and various other things that moralists of the era found troubling. The women inside the cribs were sometimes the object of reformers' concern, and sometimes simply collateral in a campaign aimed at the broader category of sin. A missionary arriving in a mining camp in 1878 with the intention of offering women a way out was operating with a specific theology about what had led to this situation and a specific prescription for what would fix it. The prescription was conversion and departure. Leave the life, accept a new framework, go somewhere else, and start again. For some women, this worked in a limited sense. For many more, the conditions that had produced the situation hadn't changed, and the offer, however genuine, was not one they could accept given where they actually were. The addiction was the most concrete barrier. You couldn't simply decide to stop and be done with it. The physical reality of opium dependence was a wall that intention alone couldn't breach. The missionary offering salvation didn't always understand that the first requirement wasn't a spiritual decision, but a physical one, getting through withdrawal in conditions that made withdrawal extremely difficult, and that the spiritual question could only be addressed on the other side of that physical wall. The women who managed the transition, when they managed it, often did so with the help of other women, not institutions, not the formal systems. Other women who were in the same situation, or who had come through it, who shared information, and sometimes shared the physical support of being present through the worst of what withdrawal required. This network was informal and undocumented, which means the historical record doesn't show it clearly, but it existed. The evidence of it appears indirectly in the accounts of women who described who had helped them and how. And this is where things change. Because underneath the entire visible structure of the crib economy, the operators, the marshals, the municipal fees, the missionary campaigns, there was this invisible layer of women helping each other survive a system that was designed to make survival difficult. They shared medicines when they had them. They covered for each other when illness made working impossible for a day. They warned each other about specific men whose behavior was dangerous. They kept track of who had not been seen in a while, which was its own kind of accounting in an environment where disappearing was common and not always for good reasons. This support didn't fix the system. Nothing available to them could fix the system, but it reduced, in small and practical ways, the number of women who died from things that were preventable if someone had known in time. The women visible in historical records who eventually left the crib economy and built different lives, who appear in later census records as landowners or as married women in small towns or as proprietors of small businesses, are the exceptions. And they are instructive exceptions, not because their paths were typical, but because their paths document what was actually possible and what it required. What it required was usually specific circumstances that didn't apply to most women in that situation. A particular contact who opened a door. Money accumulated over time in a way that the system usually prevented. A period of illness that paradoxically forced the kind of rest and separation from the environment that broke the cycle. Luck. In its rawest form, the women who didn't have those circumstances stayed in the system until the system was done with them. And the system was usually done with them before they were 40. Sometimes before they were 30. The specific cause, the overdose, the illness, the violence, varied. The timing was remarkably consistent. The mythology needed the frontier to be a story about possibility. A story about people who went west and found something. And in many cases, for many people, that was true. The frontier produced real opportunity for real people. For the women in the cribs, it produced the opposite. It produced a concentration of every disadvantage the era had available in a location with minimal oversight, in a system with no exit designed into it. What they found in the West was not possibility. It was the specific and total expression of what happened to women when the social constraints that offered thin protection were removed and nothing replaced them. That is what the alley contained. Not the saloon girl in the silk dress. Not the charming exchange at the bar. A wooden box 6 feet wide in a row of wooden boxes, a woman inside it, a bottle of laudanum on the shelf, and a door that didn't close fully between one man and the next. That was the real life, behind the myth, behind the main street, behind everything the popular version put in the foreground so that this could stay in the back. You know it now. And knowing it changes what the frontier was. The economics of the laudanum supply deserve more attention. Laudanum was sold legally in every general store and pharmacy across the frontier. It cost money, not a fortune, but enough that for a woman whose earnings were already depleted by crib rent and other deductions, the daily cost was a significant portion of what remained. The operator sometimes advanced credit on the laudanum purchase, the way the storekeeper advanced credit on supplies. The debt went on the books. The interest accumulated. A woman who owed the operator for the crib rent and also owed for the laudanum purchased on credit was in a financial position from which extraction was mathematically close to impossible without outside intervention. A woman who arrived in a Nevada mining camp in 1874 without debt, without dependence, with her health intact. In 18 months, she might have a crib rent debt, a laudanum credit balance, and a body that showed the accumulated effect of the conditions. Nobody designed that outcome. It emerged from the logic of the components. This is the part of the frontier story that requires no villain. No single man planned the system that produced these outcomes. Individual men made individual decisions that were reasonable from their own positions and catastrophic from hers. The operator charged rent because rent was what he charged. The druggist sold laudanum because laudanum was what he sold. The marshal kept order as order was defined. The difficulty was entirely on her side. All of it? The frontier didn't have the mechanisms to change that. And so the crib row continued in Nevada and Colorado and Arizona and Kansas and every other territory where men arrived in numbers, and the richest men in town understood what a row of 6-foot boxes behind the main street would produce for them financially. It continued until the camps played out and the men moved on, and the towns either grew into something else or became the ghost towns that some of them are now. The crib rows rotted where they stood. The women in them dispersed or died or found their way somewhere else if they could. The historical record mostly stopped following them when the camps closed. What remains is the documentation of the system when it was running, the census entries, the coroner's notes, the health inspector's reports, the occasional missionary account, the few letters that survived in collections nobody expected to matter. What those documents describe, read together, is not the romantic version. It is the operational reality of a system that processed human beings as efficiently and callously as the mines processed the ore coming out of the ground. The ore was valuable. The women were not, to the system that used them. That's the real story of the Cribs, not the dramatic version. The documented one, small, dark, and very specific in what it tells you about what the frontier actually was for the people the mythology most thoroughly erased.